Afternoon conference. We're going to make a start. If everyone can take their seats, please. And just want to welcome you back after lunch. My name is Cian O'Callaghan, and we are delighted to have Professor David Jacobson here from DCU and Róisín Shortall for key discussion that we're having this afternoon on the economy. And it has been commented quite a bit so far over the course of the conference that really this is the foundation for us as a party. And this is, our economic policy and how we develop it leads into all the other policies. So we're looking forward to an interesting debate and discussion, and we have a few motions as well. So we'll just start by giving a big welcome to Professor David Jacobson.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes. And I'm going to give a presentation on policy, in particular industrial policy, and in particular, in a sense, a critique of industrial policy as it has been implemented in Ireland almost since ever. I mean, I could go back much earlier than this, but I won't. It will bore us all, and it doesn't change the story. And I think the fundamentals of the story that I want to tell you are incorporated in these 8 slides. So we have an industrial policy which is basically a tax-based industrial policy. And I think this is a weakness of the whole way in which Ireland has whatever government has been in power, implemented policy to encourage economic development in Ireland, in particular since the late 1950s, but you could argue about this before that as well. Since the 1950s, there has been what we can identify as an export-led industrialization policy, encouraging foreign direct investment. And I mean, if you think about it, since 1958, that has been the policy. Think about that for a couple of seconds, that we have not changed the fundamentals of our policy for economic development since 1958, despite all the changes that have happened in the world since then. There have been little changes here and there, but fundamentally, we continue to depend on the inflow of subsidiaries of multinationals as the heart, the essence, the base, the platform of Irish industrial policy. What are the forces, in a sense, that have made this possible and, in a sense, made it dangerous? Globalization, everybody has heard the term. Here, what I mean by globalization is this spatial looseness, the foot looseness of multinationals to be anywhere they want to be. And this kind of foot looseness results in the possibility of what we call a race to the bottom. Now, we've all heard that term. What exactly do we mean by race to the bottom? What we mean is the possibility of different regimes, different state regimes, encouraging multinationals to come to their particular location on the basis of something better or something less, something better that the multinationals do want or something less that they don't want. More, for example, grants, some encouragement, advanced factories that the IDA has always provided, something less that they don't like, taxes. But not only taxes, things like regulation. So if you have things like health and safety regulation, environmental regulations, states compete against one another to diminish those things so that multinationals be attracted to their locations. So we have an ongoing race to the bottom. And another consequence is increasing income inequality and wealth inequality, which is extremely intense and growing, and is both, in a sense, a cause and a consequence of the rest of globalization. It's a cause in the sense that the people making the decisions about where to locate multinationals are the very wealthy and the very powerful, and it's a consequence in the sense that what we have, for example, in the race to the bottom is a diminution in taxes for multinationals. So what does that mean? That means that everything that results in multinationals coming here is paid for by the taxes of ordinary people. So ordinary people who pay PAYE and so on are paying the taxes, and who's deriving the benefit of it? The shareholders of the multinationals. And what is this? This is a regressive redistribution from those who can least afford it to those who can most afford to pay taxes. So these are aspects of globalization that are inherent and have been ever since multinationals started distributing multinational subsidiaries all over the place, primarily since the Second World War. And financialization is another aspect of globalization which endangers the welfare of the host countries. And by financialization, it's not just the banks and the financial institutions that have grown too big, although in some cases they have. It's also the whole fact that investment and innovation goes into financial products, derivatives, and so on. So all these clever people who do things like R&D are busily doing R&D on financial products. So the people who are rich and have money to invest in hedge funds and so on can have a wider range of products into which to invest those funds that they have for hedge funds and so on. All that, if you like, energy and creativity, which should and could be going into other things, is going into finance. And that's, in a sense, the heart of financialization, which is highly problematic. And results in a diminution of employment in other areas like manufacturing and other services. On top of all this, we've had recently the Great Recession with the austerity consequence, which was a disaster for most of Europe, and the advent of Brexit, which we haven't felt the consequences of yet, but will do. How this influences Ireland particularly is in the huge number of multinationals that now have Ireland as their base, in areas like chemicals and pharmaceuticals, in ICT and software, in international financial services, and so on. And there's different degrees of unionization, there's different degrees of, in a sense, contribution to the Irish economy, there's different degrees of embeddedness of these subsidiaries into the Irish economy, all of which are variations which need specific policy focus. In relation to indigenous SMEs, small and medium enterprises, unionization is relatively low, skill levels are relatively low, although not uniformly, and pay is relatively low in comparison to most of the subsidiaries of the multinationals. Should add here that multinationals, when you read the numbers of people employed in multinationals that the IDA publicizes, in general, you will find that that is not really the number of people that those multinationals employ. There's a large number, a large proportion, maybe 20%, maybe 30% in some cases, which are employed by subcontracting companies. And people employed by subcontracting companies have highly precarious employment. So these high-wage, high-skill graduate employment in multinationals is not uniform among the multinationals either. I was in Google recently, and I can tell you that probably, I mean, Google is amazing with these 3,000 or 4,000 people in 7 buildings in Google Quarter off Grand Canal Street. But a large proportion of those people employed in those 7 buildings are not employed by Google. They're employed by lots and lots of other little subcontracting companies. Brexit is interesting as an opportunity, as seen by the IDA, because what they want is all sorts of companies that are currently in the UK to come to Ireland and set up their headquarters here. We're faced, as progressives, I may use that general term, with a difficult situation, because we're confronted by the fact that foreign direct investment has been such a fundamental foundation of Irish industrial policy that we now are, in a sense, deeply dependent on it. We've become path dependent on a particular route. To change that path is highly difficult, firstly. Secondly, do we want to get rid of those high-wage, high-skilled jobs that the multinationals give us? Of course we don't. We know that we need those things, and we want to continue to have them. But, as I've pointed out, there are lots of critical aspects of globalization and financialization. And we need to take those into consideration as well, really deeply. And this is the really fundamental issue that I want to wave flags about, and that is that we may well be at a tipping point in this period, in this year, these 2, 3, 4 years that we are in the middle of right now. That crucial nature of this particular point, conjuncture in history, is the possibility of a very important tipping point in relation to attitudes to multinationals around the world, in particular in relation to the taxation of multinationals, and not just tax rates. Let's be clear about this. Our tax rate is 12.5%. Effectively, multinationals are paying much less than that, in some cases 1% and 2%. It's not 12.5%. There's something much broader than the tax rate, and that's the tax regime, because there are all sorts of little bits and pieces around the tax rules that allow multinationals to pay their taxes in tax-free zones, where, as a consequence of Irish regulation, they were able to declare taxes elsewhere and reduce their payments. So there's things like the OECD BEPS, base erosion profit switching. We don't have time to go into that in detail, but if anybody wants to ask me about that, I can tell you. The EU is increasingly pressurizing, through Germany and France most recently, for a Euro-level, a European-level control over corporate tax regimes. And the US, of course, under the current regime is, if nothing else, dodgy in relation to what it's going to do about the taxation of multinationals. What about indigenous enterprises? The argument might well be, we haven't a hope. We don't have indigenous enterprise. Indigenous companies can't compete in world markets. There's no hope for us. We're going down the tubes. As soon as this tipping point is reached and multinationals all leave Ireland because they can no longer pay no taxes here, they'll go somewhere else where they can pay less taxes outside the EU or whatever. This is going to be a problem for us because our indigenous firms are useless. Not so. It's not the indigenous firms that are useless, in my view. It's the policies that we've implemented to encourage them over the many years. And there are many examples of good SMEs in Ireland. There also have been diminution in industries which are traditional industries which have gone away because of technological change, innovations, economies of scale, and so on. And that's inevitable. Areas like furniture, clothing, footwear, and printing, printing most recently. But I don't have time to go into detail, but anybody asks me, I can tell you how many examples of those industries could have been saved if we had introduced the right policies. Instead of having this TBIP, this tax-based industrial policy, which was too generic and too applicable across the board, only to result in an overfocus on subsidiaries of multinationals. The second thing is an individual firm focus. So in the furniture industry in County Monaghan, for example, there were something like 60 firms all producing different kinds of furniture, all cooperating with one another to produce groups of products which could have been marketed as sitting room furniture, bedroom furniture, kitchen furniture, and so on. And what did Irish agency Enterprise Ireland do? It decided to focus on an individual firm to encourage that individual firm to develop, in a sense, as an opposition to IKEA, which was a failing objective in the first place. They gave $3 million to John Coyle, and within 2 years, it had ceased production completely. Instead of encouraging interaction among firms and cooperation and industrial district kind of activity, there are multinationals in Ireland. Not only the food ones. I mean, I've mentioned the food ones there, but there are many others like Smurfit and like Cement Roadstone. If we really push it, we can include Ryanair. I know you don't want to, but there are other individual firms. And I mean, I've just named 3 there. And again, I could tell you the story of each of those 3 firms in great detail. Again, don't have time, but let me just say one thing about Ocean Path. It's in the food industry. The other 2 are in engineering. Ocean Path is a firm that had a very close, tight relationship with the supermarket chain. And as a result of this cooperation, deep cooperation and sharing of information, Ocean Path became a really successful fish processing company, which is now no longer with that chain. The chain was Superquin, which has since been sold. Ocean Path remains a really successful exporter of innovative fish products from Ireland. So, what is the essence of the success? The essence of the success is sticky places. Globalization and financialization is slippery space. What you have to have in order to have indigenous industrialization is sticky places in slippery space. We have to have ways of embedding economic activity, most easily achieved by SMEs that emerge from the Irish base, which, as a result of sticky place in this location, generate organizational excellence, networking capability, and networking excellence, but also networking application. They network, and as a result of that networking, they have innovative ability and succeed, in particular as Irish-based exporting companies. And the future, therefore, is a choice between tax-based industrial policy on one hand, or a much more varied policy which focuses on strategies to develop these things like sticky places in the slippery space of globalization. Tax-based industrial policy means continued race to the bottom. Do we want to be part of that? Do we want to race to the bottom? Do we want to, in the end, to have lowest possible wages and salaries so that multinationals come here to employ even skilled people, but relatively low-paid skilled people? We don't want that. Do we want Ireland to be attractive to them because we have the least regulation in relation to how they can behave and perform? No, we don't want that. So we want the alternative. We want Ireland to be a sticky place in slippery space. And that's more and more important because of this feeling that a lot of us have at the moment that we're at a tipping point in the whole encouragement of subsidiaries of multinationals to go to different locations. If that tipping point tips over, we definitely have to have an alternative set of policies in place. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, David, for that contribution. I'm just going to hand over to Róisín Shortall for a quick response. Thanks.
Thanks, Cian, and thank you very much for that excellent presentation, David. I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes on where we are as a party in terms of economic policy and business policy. And I'm very keen just that we have plenty of time for people to contribute to the debate on the motions that are before us in this area. I think we've got 4 motions on the agenda. So I just want to make a few very short comments at this point. I think we like to think that politics and democratic governments have responsibility for how their countries operate. But increasingly, I think we see that big business and certainly the global corporate entities are the people who are calling the shots. And in many ways, as David has said, dictating to national governments on how they should run their economies. And these global entities, David has already kind of talked about who they are, the tech giants, the big pharma, the energy suppliers, among others, are the people who are dictating policy to governments, not just in Europe, but right across the world. And I think it was a very welcome development during the week at Davos, where Macron himself actually drew attention, and this point was the very focus of his contribution the other day, where he talked about the very real and present dangers of a race to the bottom in terms of taxation and employment. And of course, it is critical that the response to this phenomenon has to be a joint response. It has to be a response that engages all countries at a European level, at an OECD level, and wider if that's possible. Because we can't continue with a situation where multinationals are playing one country against another. And the temptation, obviously, is for individual countries to break away and to do their own thing and to attract jobs. But that is a zero-sum game, and that only brings you to the bottom if you allow that to continue. So I think it's a very welcome development that increasingly now Europe is beginning to engage in this whole area and look at, and pose the question, is this actually where developed countries want to go? Is this the future then for developing countries as well? And how can we put the brake on this kind of development? Put the brake on so that it restores kind of control to democratic governments and restores standards in terms of the kind of decisions that individual democratic governments have control over. And I think that's a growing sense that people have about a loss of control. It's particularly prevalent here, I think, in relation to those kind of issues that come up for the locked-out generation. And we heard a lot about that last night, where that sense that, employment is being downgraded all the time, and we're on that slippery slope towards very few protections for people in employment. And certainly when it comes to the taxation area, Ireland hasn't distinguished itself. It has operated a policy which has, yes, attracted a lot of good quality jobs traditionally, but that only worked as long as other countries weren't engaged in the same kind of offers that Ireland has made to multinationals. And of course, with developments in the States with Trump and indeed a number of other countries undercutting us, again, it underlines the point that where are we going on this? We have to cry stop at a certain point and say, can we do this in a more sustainable way? And of course, our headline corporate tax rate at 12.5%, it is very low by EU standards, but we know that behind that, our own revenue has been very happy to engage in secret deals behind the scenes with various big multinationals where, they're paying little or no tax, down as low as 1 or 2%. And that approach in relation to corporate tax has been very much aided and abetted by government policy over recent years. So in that way, it's felt that it's only a matter of time that this, bidding war will continue. And the ultimate aim of many of the multinationals is to achieve a system or a situation where there is little or no tax being paid by corporate bodies. As I say, that's a zero-sum game and doesn't offer any future for anybody. The Social Democrats then, in terms of our position on this, we have said consistently that we believe that the 12.5% corporate tax rate should remain. And we're saying that particularly in the context of attempts to undercut that it should remain for the moment, but that we should insist that corporations actually pay the 12.5%. And I think, I'd be interested to hear views from members about, whether that policy should be retained or whether we should move away from it. And we're very conscious, I think, also of the potential for raising very substantial additional funding for the state if we could achieve a real 12.5% effective tax rate from our multinational sector. Because, we're very conscious of the fact that our aim is to achieve a fair society, but that has to be based and can only be fueled by a strong economy. In relation to our other policies that we've set down, we've identified a number of areas in relation to diversifying away from that overemphasis on FDI, but also, of course, being positioned to address in a more effective way the kind of threats that are coming down the track with Brexit. And some of the things that we've set down very clearly is the need for a new strategy for business, a need to invest in infrastructure. I mean, there's a huge catch-up job to be done there in terms of, obviously, balanced rural development, infrastructure, particularly in relation to transport and rural broadband, to have an adequate housing supply, and that is increasingly adding to our lack of competitiveness at the moment, and guaranteed supplies of basic infrastructure such as water, for example. These are major deficits that we have. They have a huge impact on our competitiveness. And we have now the National Capital Plan coming up for review and decisions about that to be announced soon. And we're saying that the overriding emphasis from that capital plan has to be to catch up on that huge deficit of infrastructural development that we've seen. We're also saying, of course, we're very much hamstrung by the kind of fiscal rules, the very restrictive fiscal rules that are in place at the moment, and that we believe government should be challenging those much more strongly. They need to be challenged because if we're talking about using funds to invest in critical infrastructure that will last us for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years and more, well then the calculations should change in terms of the kind of spending that we can engage in. We're also identifying the whole area of education as being critical in terms of positioning Ireland to develop a stronger economy and to develop, in particular, a much stronger indigenous economy. We're talking about class sizes, far too big at primary level, and we're saying that they should be reduced as a matter of urgency down to 20:1. At second level, we're saying that there needs to be much greater emphasis on the STEM subjects. At third level, there is a crisis of funding there at the moment, and that needs to be addressed both in our universities and in our technological colleges. And the other thing that we need is a much stronger new apprenticeship programme that actually meets the needs of our growing economy. And David alluded to the issue of regulation. I think, while the pressure is on at a multinational level to drive down, costs, drive down tax, drive down standards in employment, and drive down regulation, from the point of view of many of our own companies, and indeed, I'd have to say, from the point of view of attracting investment also from abroad, regulation and oversight are critical. In the main, properly functioning companies want to know exactly how the rules apply. What are the rules in a country and how do they apply? And will there be a level playing pitch? And, they need clarity about that, and they will adjust to operate within those rules. But the problem is that it's been far too fluid, and our oversight bodies have been far too weak. And that's something that we really need to beef up on. The other points that have been made in our policies to date, of course, are the needs for far greater support for enterprise, for start-up companies in particular, and we believe that there should be a separate fund, an enhanced fund provided to Enterprise Ireland in order to assist start-up companies. We're saying that there needs to be a new online portal in order to streamline administration for developing companies and self-employed people, and we need to ensure that their interaction with government agencies is as streamlined as it possibly can be. And of course we also make recommendations in relation to reform of the tax and welfare system to bring those systems for the self-employed more into line with PAYE workers. So there are a number of the policies that we have there at the moment. I know there's a number of members that are keen to get involved in expanding those and updating them, and we very much look forward to that taking place after this conference. We'd warmly welcome the involvement of people with expertise and interest in this area to contribute to expanding on those policies and developing them for the future. So thank you very much, everybody.